And I don't really have any introductions. I just want to thank everyone for coming. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor David Sterritt to guide us through a conversation with John Gianvito about his wonderful film, Her Socialist Smile.
Okay, and once again, thank you so much for being here, John, especially since you have not been in tip-top physical condition over these last few days. So as I said in an email to you, above and beyond the call of duty, but we're very grateful to you for doing this with us. So let me start.
Round is a good one. So.
Well, let me start with a question you never could have expected. What was it that led you to this subject? It's a very interesting, it's more than interesting, it's a fascinating subject and an unusual subject. And I'm very curious about what steered you in this direction.
Well, the roots of my interest in this go back quite a ways. Approximately 21 years ago is when I first came upon any kind of notion that there was this dimension of Helen Keller's life. And I traced that to some writings by the radical historian Howard Zinn, and who I eventually made a film inspired by his writings, but this was previous to that endeavor. And I was immediately intrigued, and I did some poking around and got my hands on some of Helen Keller's speeches and writings around socialist ideas, and was struck with how relevant and germane they seemed, as if, you know, they could have been written that week. You know, so little had changed, and I thought maybe there's, you know, certainly nothing I was exposed to in my growing up and learning about the figure of Helen Keller, that this could be a subject for a film. And so for roughly a year, I started researching that prospect, and I readily was struck by how little I could find in terms of any kind of photographic record or motion picture or audio recordings of what was a large swath of her public life, typically, you know, identified as roughly between when she was 30 to 45 in terms of her most outgoing engagement with an ardent but really even militant socialist agenda. And so it puzzled me, because she was, even as a young girl, as you know, was one of the most famous women on the planet. And so the film reveals to some of the ways in which that documentation, I think, disappeared, but I have some other theories about that as well, which we could potentially talk about. But the long and short of it was, when I found, and that period also coincided with the last big loss of material, which was September 11th, 2001, when the Helen Keller International Archive was destroyed. And so at that juncture, I just thought, okay, this was an interesting idea, but for a filmmaker, I'm not really sure what I could do. And I set it aside. And fast forward to about 4 years ago, I had finished another film, and I was ruminating about where I might go next. And this idea starts reemerging. And the way I always tell the story, it's as if there was this little voice in my head that was saying, okay, John, you know, you have an interest in, you said you had this interest in making a film about, you know, arguably the most famous blind, deaf person in the world. You have no images, you have no sounds. That's an interesting creative problem. You shouldn't back away from it. And I think it was a constellation of things, including entering the darkest years of Trumpism, that propelled me to embrace the enterprise and see what I could do with it. So that's how it started. It took on full traction at that point.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. I mean, it has always seemed to me that the political, I've been sort of dimly aware of the political aspect of her life and her work, but it's clearly been overshadowed for almost everybody by her fame as a disabled person, multiply disabled, and as a spokesperson for that community and so forth. And, you know, she's more famous for being deafblind than she is for being a political thinker. But you know, what you've done is to really drag that stuff right to the center stage. And I'm wondering how you feel yourself about sort of the balance now that should be struck between her obvious, very real importance as just an exemplary figure who accomplished so much, regardless of what field it was in, despite enormous handicaps, and the actual substance of her work. I'm just curious about the balance between those things.
Well, I certainly think there's room for celebrating, you know, the richness of what she contributed during the course of her lifetime. I very consciously set out not to make a sort of biopic or to, you know, there were other things as I, you know, consumed endless volumes of her own writing and then the various biographies that are out there that I found fascinating and were revelatory about her character and her life, but that didn't have a place for me in this project. I wanted this to be a film about ideas, specifically about her political ideas. And to the extent that biographical elements enter into the construct of the film, it's to support that and it's sort of tangential to a degree to the real aims of the work. Certainly contemporary scholarship around Helen Keller no longer ignores this, and there's some good books out there. But in terms of wider awareness, it remains something that hasn't been touched, at least in film. And I wonder, even younger people today, how many are as aware of the figure of Helen Keller herself as I was growing up. But the embrace, and you know, and I will admit, admittedly a challenge. The embrace this an admittedly challenging film has had so far suggests to me that there is an interest in what she had to say, and that there's use value that people are finding in it, beyond just it serving as some kind of historical corrective, which was not, again, what drew me to it, was to just fix this omission, but because I really felt that these ideas were needed, or still needed. Yeah.
Well, now getting to the style of the film, the manner in which all this material is unfolded, I think it seems pretty plain to me that the most kind of radical move of the film is to present large amounts of text on the screen. This is interesting to me partly because you have a kind of a track record here. I mean, I looked again recently at your earlier film, Profit Motive and the Whispering Wind, which is a very, very different kind of film in some ways. In some ways, it's very similar politically and so forth. And again, very much inspired by Howard Zinn, who was at Boston University back when I went there in the 60s, by the way. But for those not familiar with Profit Motive and the Whispering Wind, which is not hard to get a hold of on the internet and watch, it consists mostly, I guess, of words printed on the screen, except in this case, they're plaques and words on monuments and memorials and so forth, celebrating great moments in what we could call, I guess, progressive American history. So again, we have words on the screen is the point. But here you carry that to a more radical degree by filling an otherwise black screen with large amounts of words. And I'm just wondering, obviously, you were faced with a shortage of all kinds of, you know, there was no cornucopia of visual materials that you could draw on. But I'm wondering how you hit on that particular solution and whether you regarded it as a risky one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. And there's some online thing that gave me some award for risk taking with this film. But I can't say that I was trying to be provocative in that choice. Like most elements of the work, I arrive at these decisions in a very organic process with a lot of rumination over a long period of time. And so in the absence of, orthodox documentary materials, what were some of the choices that seemed you could have somebody, you could dramatize them, and you could have someone being, performing Helen Keller giving one of these speeches, or sitting in her studio and hearing it through voiceover. And that felt sort of tired to me and problematic in a number of ways that I didn't want to step into. I could have had it all spoken out loud, but then if there were images happening at the same time that was being spoken, this is an issue I've wrestled with in some of my other films, and I've generally found that the eye is always stronger than the ear, so that if I'm being told a lot of things that I think I should ingest and that are important, but I'm also having this steady stream of new images coming at me, even if it's for a fraction of a second, your brain has to process that new visual material, and you're not wholly engaged with what's being said. Mm-hmm. And because it was of utmost importance to me that people actually did ingest this, that I find a way for people to ingest these ideas, and because fundamentally this is how Helen engaged with the world around her. It was, she did do public speaking, but that was, nominal compared to the voluminous writing that she did throughout her work. And so for her, writing and reading was a principal way of knowing the world. And I even thought about, should there be, even if I do just put the text up there, should there be audio behind it, even if it's just presence or nature sound or something. But this can be different for other people, but for myself, when I read a book, I like to have as much silence as possible, so I'm just really absorbed in that. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying I didn't think that it was a bit unusual when I was making it, and that not everyone would go on board with it, but part of me was just sort of dug in and felt like, is it really such a radical thing to ask somebody to read in a movie theater? And if it is, okay, well, I'm dealing with a radical individual here, so the radical form is part of, is in concert with the subject matter.
Yeah, here. I salute that idea, or those ideas. Another aspect of the film, however, is very much, speaking of nature, nature material. And again, clearly, Helen Keller had a very profound relationship with the world of nature. She loved nature and was immersed in it, I guess, whenever she could be. You, however, also have a track record here. I'm thinking again of Prophet Motive and The Whispering Wind. The Whispering Wind gets into the title of that film. So I'm just curious about how you came to also want to break away from the spoken text and from the occasional archival material, and just take us out into the trees and the flowers and the whispering wind.
Mm-hmm. So again, this happened in this, I keep using this word, organic way. I had a few ingredients that were starting to, that I felt like I could employ in building this film, but only a few. And I was, as I was reading her autobiographies, it's where I became cognizant of just how passionate she was about her natural surroundings, and how much she valued the time she spent lying for hours in her garden or taking long walks in the woods. And And it was also where I discovered, and this was maybe 6 months into having already decided this was a project I was going to pursue, that she describes, she lived in various places through the course of her life, but repeatedly she said, she describes the place where she was happiest were the years she spent in Rentham, Massachusetts. This also coincides with her more radical period. And it turns out that home is about a 10-minute drive from where I currently live. Although there's no signage on the street that tells you where the house is, I eventually found it and sort of snuck onto the property and got some of the shots you see in the film. But so I felt that discovering that, and because that was it was yet another profound thing that of kinship that I shared then with Helen, not just our shared political perspectives, but because I am a kind of pantheist, and that's been such a important, and to me, there's a politics to my relationship to nature that's part and parcel of the work that I do, that allowed me to bring that back into this work. So I was thrilled to find that, because then that gave me something else that I could use, and that was might seem perplexing, I think, for some viewers through a part of the duration of the film, until you hear her say that that's her favorite thing in life, which you hear interested is to be in nature. Because because the tactile, her principal senses were touch and smell, and smell is generally not something the cinema affords. I was consciously trying to film things in a way that felt tactile without being heavy-handed and sort of, this is Helen's POV and we're watching everything through the eyes of this woman, but that it's suggestive of or at least enabling us to have as close and present an experience of palpable an experience of some of the richness of our natural surroundings.
I just can't resist asking about something, and you may have just sort of answered it. I was really interested in that snail who emerges, I think, as one of the stars of the movie. There's a long shot. Oh, there's also a caterpillar later. I'm just wondering how those particular shots of actual animate beings got into the film. Just an intuitive choice, or anything more than that going on?
That's what showed up when I was out on my walks, and that slug was just in the middle of on a rock. I was by myself, and got down on the ground and spent some time with him, but I'd say 80% of the shots are just here in my yard. I don't have a huge yard, but I live in a place where there's conservation land behind me, so different things come out of the woods from time to time, and just a lot of, I've learned to just be responsive to things that I see when I see them, not to put them off, or not to overthink them, to overshoot material, so that the pieces that I end up using are, have been mined, that I've really put some time to it. It actually reminds me of a story that I've always remembered when I was a student, and then a student in graduate school with the documentary filmmaker Richard Leacock, and he would tell the story of a lesson. He'd often tell lessons that he learned from being the cameraman on Robert Flaherty's final film, a sorely problematic film, Louisiana Story, but nonetheless, he told this anecdote of them going to the set one morning, and like a lot of Flaherty films, this was not by any means a cinema verite style documentary. There were actors and a large crew and so forth, and so they were all waiting for Leacock and Flaherty to get there, and they were walking through this forest and came upon this picture perfect spider web with, like you see in, you know, storybooks with dewdrops and so forth, and Flaherty said, now there's an image, and Ricky's thought was, okay, duly noted, you know, we need to get a shot of the spider web. And the lesson was, Flaherty said, no, we've got to get it now. Even though they didn't have cell phones or ways to reach the rest of the crew, the responsibility was to the image and to get it when it's there. So I didn't waste any time when I saw that slug, and I didn't know where it would. I wasn't filming things thinking, would this go against this particular piece of text or so forth. That happened through trial and error in the editing room. But.
Yeah. Oh, very, very interesting. So I guess I misnamed it. It's a slug. Looked like a snail to me, but I guess they're related.
They're related.
Yeah.
Snails have the shell, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, very interesting stuff, I must say. Another question that I wanted to ask, and this is a sort of a large question, but you know, well, let me start asking it this way. How much real influence in her time do you feel that Helen Keller had with her political speaking and writing? You know, on a political level, how did she really manage to reach a lot of people, and she really managed to have much impact, you know, in the particular time frame when she was around in her public life?
Another very good question, and you know, measuring impacts of all kinds of very hard to sort of weigh what that is. But she, sort of any pronouncement that she made was often front page news. You know, part of my research was going through archives of old newspapers from these years, and even the things that are now kind of downplayed or not spoken about at all in biographies of Helen Keller were known. I mean, it wasn't hidden, even if there were objections to her viewpoints. It was newsworthy if she was saying these things. That it was really when she started working for the American Foundation for the Blind that the big gate comes down on this part of her life, and that's part of what I think is not appreciated in terms of why we don't know this history. That, I'm not saying today's American Foundation for the Blind, but during you know, from 1924 till when she died in 1968, that was her main source of income, and they clearly got to her and said, you know, you have to sort of cease and desist on this stuff if you really care about raising money for the blind and deaf. And to her credit, she didn't completely. I mean, there's some people think that that's sort of ended it, but if you read her letters and diaries and certain gestures that she made through the remainder of her life, she never disavowed any of those views that my film presents. Within the socialist movement itself, she was embraced. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, so-called rebel girl, who eventually became president of the American Communist Party, attributes her encounters with Helen Keller's ideas as leading her towards her own embrace of socialism.
There's 9 people participating in a RIF event, so I don't feel so bad.
You know, she was friends with Emma Goldman and Eugene Debs and many of the major figures in the movement, and so there's a sense of solidarity and mutual support that they extended to one another, up until a point in which, you know, the whole movement was brutally put down, as the film also documents. That was also part of her shift, I think, because there really wasn't a party to get behind at that point. And the McCarthy years were on the horizon and so forth.
One of the interesting things about this movie's appearance now is that I would imagine there's a lot more receptivity to it now among especially younger people than there might have been, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, which is to say there's just seems to be a very strong renewed interest in ideas that, you know, were for a long time more or less discredited in mainstream American discourse, you know, socialism just being, let's say, the catch-all term for that. So I think the movie is very well timed in that respect. Did that play into the reason why you came to this project now?
As I hinted at the beginning, it was some kind of a emotional, spiritual support for me through the Trump period, knowing that I had this material to work on, and because I felt that it was a kind of barricade against a lot of the onslaughts of what I was hearing daily, and so I was very keen to have it done, if possible, before the elections, and it did just manage that. And certainly, you know, we're not rid of all of that by any means. So I'm hoping, as now that the film has been acquired for distribution, and it looks like Lincoln Center will do a short theatrical run of the film sometime in late summer, early fall, that might sort of renew awareness of it a bit more, and it's certainly already through that distributor available to educational institutions and so forth.
Yeah, that's excellent news. Now, this is a great segue toward another question I want to ask, which is that, do you think that a movie can actually change hearts and minds in today's media-drenched world?
Well,
I guess I'm asking that first as sort of a general question. You know, can a movie do that?
Well, David, it's a subject I've devoted years to thinking about and to writing about and to teaching about. I periodically teach a course called Cinema and Social Change that looks at the history of variant approaches to politically engaged practice, and you know, you know, if we look at that history, that, you know, there are literally films that have affected laws, that have gotten people out of prison, that have been useful in political movements. I give some of those in one of my articles as examples of proof positive that films can do that. I also give examples of what I call proof negative, that if you look at the history of how many filmmakers have had their works censored, have been arrested, and actually many examples of filmmakers who were actually murdered for the films. If films had no power to actually make a difference, then why would such concerted effort be made to strike them down? And then I address the whole issue of, you know, the majority of us who can't point to saying, well, I can't tell you that my film, you know, tangibly made some difference in the world that I can absolutely prove to you. I think we have to all be humble as artists about, you know, our ambitions, and at the same time recognize that change happens in, you know, in subterranean ways over periods of time. You don't know what the absolute constellation of things are in somebody's life, where they see a film about something, they by chance, then that idea comes back up in the newspaper a few days later, or someone brings it up in conversation, and something happens where they're willing to pay attention to it because of, and you don't know what role you played in orchestrating that. I certainly get these little affirmations from time to time that people who seem to really value the work that I do, and that I, you know, I can't deny that there are at least individuals that have told me that the work matters to them, and you know, ultimately, is any of it a numbers game? I mean, if any of us feel like we've made a difference in one person's life, we should be grateful that if it was a difference that really improved and um, their existence, then that's something. It's not nothing.
How true. Your film is about adventurous ideas, but as we've already touched on in more than one way, it's also radical in approach and in style and in presentation. And I'm wondering if you have ever been tempted in the direction of, you know, more sort of directly, you know, grab the audience by the lapels and tell them something in straightforward language so that they will remember it that night, or something, you know, in other words, agitprop cinema. Have you ever been interested in the stuff that goes along, you know, of which there's a great deal nowadays, and most political documentaries are the sort of things that I guess we see on HBO and Netflix and whatnot. I'm wondering if you've ever been tempted in that direction, or if you see yourself as just as much a, what is the word I'm looking for? A very, very idiosyncratic, really unique stylist, as well as someone who is interested in engaging with ideas through cinema.
So I don't think it's wise to subscribe to any one methodology in terms of film practice. You know, there are films that I can appreciate that have the capacity to reach a much wider audience, and maybe they're not as a result, maybe they're not as politically radical as I would like, but they're still, the world benefits from the existence of these films. You know, when you talk about, you know, do I think about, you know, grabbing the audience by the throat and thinking about different types of agitprop art, but I know the kind you're referencing, and I think about a comment made by a filmmaker that many people may not know, but is a filmmaker that I've grown to admire a lot, a filmmaking couple, the French director Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Houillet, and Jean-Marie Straub once said, you know, if you hit people over the head with your beautiful ideas, your head still hurts, you know. And they talk about their own films when they would speak about them. That Danielle sadly passed away a number of years ago, but they would say that we make our films so that people can walk out of them, and that often gets a laugh because people who have seen their work know how intransient and difficult they can appear, and so they think, okay, if that's your goal, you're pretty good at it. You know, people are going to walk out of these films, but what they go on to say is it's not that we're happy about people walking out of them, but he goes as far as to say, you know, for him, there's a sort of fascism about the kind of cinema that's all about keeping you in your seat and directing your eye to where to look, and so they're saying no to that and saying, you know, this is what we're interested in, you know, come, look, listen, but we're not going to use tricks or strategies to keep you in your place. And there's something in that has resonated for me in my own natural inclinations in the films I make. I'm not woefully trying to be different. I mean, there are economic factors that I can't deny that influence the choices I have each time I make films. but then there's also the basic one, which is I often say to my own students that because it's often a question that people ask, who's the audience for your films, or who do you imagine the audience to be? And it sounds like a reasonable question, but to me, what is an audience? An audience is an abstraction. It's a room full of individuals with their individual likes and dislikes. And for me, the only compass that I feel can guide any creative person is to make the work that you yourself want to sit down and watch, that because no one else has made it, and that this interests me, and this pacing works for me, and to just block everything else out. And obviously the risk at the end of that trajectory is you discover, okay, I am some kind of alien, and what I'm interested in, no one else is interested in. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the gamble you always have to take. So I actually remember saying to my partner when I was starting this project, I said, I'm pretty sure this is going to be my least successful film of all, because I was aware that I was going to be using a lot of text but again, by just trusting my own inclinations, it seems, it has people have taken to it,
Yeah, they certainly have. You yourself have been quoted as saying, "The only reason I make films anymore is to remind myself and others that there are a lot more important things than films," which is a very interesting idea, I think, and one that I certainly can relate to. I mean, I've devoted my life mainly to watching films and writing about films, and I totally agree. There are a lot of things that are more important than films, but films are one way, one channel for engaging with our culture in all of its aspects, politically, socially, culturally, every way, economically.
And a very powerful one still,
yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yep. No, I absolutely think so. I really would like to. I see there's a couple of chats, and I've gotten in the habit doing my Zoom classes of not looking at the chats because I tend to find them distracting. But I would love to know if others would like to join in here, ask questions, make comments, either through the chats or ideally by actually coming on the screen. So what do you say, folks?
Don't feel shy.
Yeah. We're a fairly modest company here, so there's plenty of room.
Grace has her hand up.
We got it. Yeah.
Hi.
Great.
I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks for the great conversation so far. It's really helped me understand the film better, and I did really enjoy watching it as well. My question is that earlier on you said one of the things that you liked about working on the film is that it was a challenge because there wasn't that much footage or just anything about Helen Keller. I was wondering if working on this project, you learned anything about filmmaking that you didn't know before, or came up with any new ideas about the medium.
That's a really interesting question. My first thought in response to that, Grace, is I think over time, I started to feel that had there existed a lot of the traditional archival materials, that I don't think that the film would have benefited from that. And that was an interesting thing to realize, that I started thinking, I hope that I would have had the strength to resist using more of them, that it might have been a sort of distraction, and I don't want to call out any particular filmmakers who do a lot of classical historical documentaries, but you can imagine ones you've seen. And again, I'm not putting down any approaches, but for me, I liked the certain austerity of the choices that I used, in that I felt that if you did get to see, when you did get to see an actual image of Helen, it had more resonance because it was so sparingly given to you. that's one thought that I have about what I might have learned.
Thank you.
I would imagine that if there had been this abundance of traditional archival materials, images and footage and stuff like that, probably a film or more films on this subject would have been made previously by filmmakers who would have seen that and the opportunity that was there.
One
and
would
that,
hope, yeah.
Yeah, but not having that. But I mean, I'm saying that other filmmakers weren't up to the challenge of taking on a subject for which those materials didn't exist. And just kudos to you and being able to be attracted by that challenge.
If I
There's
can,
another question there.
You bring something to mind that I wanted to get to, Craig, and I'll do it now, which is that anyone who had, I presume everybody on this engaged in this conversation has seen the film and looked at it carefully, but somebody who had not might get the idea from what we were talking about that there is this movie is more austere than it actually is. Not only is there that gorgeous nature footage, for example, but there's like comedy in it. There are those scenes with the theater on the screen, and we get the little bits of interview dialogue and so forth. And sometimes it's very funny. One of my favorite bits in it is where somebody asks her if she ever thinks of marriage. And she says, yes, I do. Are you proposing to me? Which is really quite a marvelous thing. So I'm just, again, I'm sure that this was all arrived at organically, but how did that come to be a recurring element in the film?
Yeah.
And the music.
Okay, so from 1920 to 24, Helen and Annie Sullivan were on the vaudeville stage, and they, Annie did it a bit reluctantly because it was considered sort of déclassé to do that. You were with acrobats and circus performers and whatever, the strange and unusual, and but it meant they could stay in one place longer than when they were in the lecture circuit. They were being paid more for just a 20-minute routine, and they needed the money. And Helen actually loved the experience of the people she met and being on the circuit. So over the years of doing the research, I was able to put together a compendium of the part of their act that was this Q&A, and I regret a little bit that I didn't include even more of the humor, because she was very witty, and I emphasized the more political commentary often, but and I can't remember them all, but like I remember someone asked her, can you feel moonshine? And she said, no, but I can smell it. So I had that, and I thought, okay, that's a fun element, but how do I incorporate it into the film? And I thought, if could I find an existing vaudeville stage anymore? And where had she done this? And she opened her act at the Palace Theater in New York, which survives. It's one of the remaining original vaudeville stages, and what at its time, the most famous place to perform. But I thought, what are the odds are that I'm going to get permission to film on the stage of Times Square Theater? But I pursued it, and in fact, the current managers were didn't take long to get back to me, and they said, thank you for your idea or your interest, but at the moment, SpongeBob SquarePants the musical is performing, and it's on an unlimited run, and they have copyright over their image and so forth. And then I wrote back saying, well, that's fine. I'm really not interested in that. My hope was I could just maybe get in there early and just film the empty stage. And they said, well, unfortunately, they put up all this blue screen and it doesn't really even look like a stage. And so, so that was out. So I'm sitting in my office. I teach at Emerson College in Boston, and I'm thinking, okay, where she must have performed in Boston. Where did she perform in Boston? I'm doing this research, and lo and behold, the place she performed in Boston is literally adjacent to my office. Like literally, it's the building, the Paramount Theater. I'm in the Paramount building, and the Paramount Theater is next to us. It wasn't called the Paramount Theater when she performed there. It was B.F. Keith's theater, and it's not what you see in the film is not the physical theater, but the designs were all based on that original theater. So it is a recreation of that theater that she performed in. And so again, one of these little synchronicities that suddenly made that possible for me. And then you asked about the music. I don't know how, I didn't ever get too much detail on this, but there's a theme that called a piece of music that says it's a theme inspired by Helen Keller, called The Star of Happiness. And that was one of the pieces of music that was original music that was written for her act. And I'm quite sure no one has heard since that time. It took a long time to even find a copy of the original sheet music. And then I found a composer to score it for me. Martin Marks, maybe you know David, who's a great silent film composer.
Scholar.
Scott, yeah. And then the other pieces you hear over the vaudeville scenes were also used during her act. So that's in keeping with that. And there are other little elements that people don't have to know, but that found their way into the film, like the use of the imagery of stone walls that you see periodically through the film. She had, when she was living in Rentham, she had these large stone walls, and there's photographs of her sitting on them and walking alongside them. But then she wrote a book-length poem called "The Song of the Stone Wall." Sort of a praise to the early history of the founding of the nation and the history behind these stones. Sad and hopeful. So that was an allusion to that. And I found out that she liked to horseback ride, which people wouldn't necessarily associate with Helen Keller. And so that led me to the image of the horse that's in the film. And little things like that. She had a famous encounter with Enrico Caruso that was in the news at the time, and could apparently hear to some extent the vibrations of his voice. So that led to incorporating the Caruso moment in the film. So there's a reason often behind some of the choices.
And there really are such a wealth of different materials in the movie. When one starts to enumerate them, there turn out to be really an awful lot of them, which is very interesting and very impressive. And certainly everything just comes together just very gracefully. It's a very, very graceful film among its many other qualities, I think, and that's something I always value. How did one bit of actual oratory make its way into the film, which is Noam Chomsky at a lectern? It's terrific stuff, but I'm wondering how you came to select that one particular bit of speechifying and nothing else like that in the film.
Yeah. So I'm painfully aware still how frequently people toss out the word socialism as a pejorative and just utterly dismiss it when it had some measure of real political legitimacy through a portion of our country's history, if we're just speaking about the US. usually the argument is just like, well, it's, look at the countries that were socialist, you know, they, you know, what a ruin they brought their country, their, you know, what Stalin did to the Soviet people and so forth. And I was afraid that despite all the arguments that Helen was making for the value of, you know, her definition really was a world in which the welfare of one is the welfare of everyone, and just a basic humanitarian embrace of the need to take care of each other, and with some measure of equality and justice, that still people would dismiss the, you know, or paint the usual negative impressions they have of socialism. So when I discovered on the internet this it was in a Q&A after one of Chomsky's speeches from many years ago, where he elaborated on, you know, I felt very succinctly, you know, pointed out how both the West and the East seized on the term capitalism for their own ends, but perverted the meaning of the term. It allowed that idea to get in there, and I felt the idea was needed to make sure that that argument wasn't still lurking, maybe for the spectator. And of course, Noam is one of my heroes, and I had the pleasure of hearing him hundreds of times living in, you know, going to MIT and then living in the Boston area. And I've interviewed him in the past, and I've gotten his permission when I wanted to use this clip. I reached out to him, and he was kind enough to say yes.
I think it is quite remarkable that we do have at this moment an extremely major figure. I'm thinking, of course, of Bernie Sanders from Craig's own state, from RIF's own state of Vermont, who is an avowed socialist and who has got an enormous following. And it doesn't seem to, you know, erase him from the public consciousness the way that term would have, again, just not that many years ago. So I think it is quite remarkable. The term seems to be having something of a comeback, as does a skepticism of capitalism that was just not around. And of course, all this fascinating because it pretty much coexists with the age of Trump, which is the direct opposite of all of this. So anyway, we live in a very interesting moment.
Yeah. And it's interesting that many of the people who voted for Trump have said that had they not voted for Trump, their second choice would have been Bernie Sanders. So what does that tell you about the possibility that some of these ideas could gain even more traction down the road? There's something I'm not, and I hope to learn more about him sort of late in life now, but I'm not a scholar yet of the Italian writer Antonio Gramsci, but I have been reading some of his work, and I've been drawn to a concept that he has, which is what he calls the war of position. That if you study, he said one of the fundamental things in a political struggle is that you have to at least start. You have to get your ideas on the table. You have to be on the agenda before, and people have to start considering them before you can even get to the next stage, which is he calls the war of maneuver. But so to me, that was part of this, just resurrect, you know, being one of hopefully many things that are happening that are resurrecting the notion that socialism is not a boogeyman, and that someone as revered and eloquent and deep thinking as Helen Keller could have firmly embraced these throughout the duration of her life, and to maybe ask questions about why we've not wanted to know that in the intervening years. What was behind that? Was it just the loss of those fires, or was there more worry about that? And you can find parallels in, you know, the way Martin Luther King Jr.'s life was in some ways sanitized, and the more radical sides of him are only now sort of coming out. Or Rosa Parks, I grew up thinking she was this, poor old woman who just got tired of on a particular day and not wanting to go to the back of the bus, and that her bravery at that moment led to Montgomery bus boycotts, and now I know that she was a radical organizer, went to the Highlander School and had, planned a lot of things for a long time. Her hero was Malcolm X more than it was Martin Luther King Jr. So we have to always be on guard for this, sanitization of our history.
Absolutely. Well, we have used up almost all of our time. Let me ask once more, is there anything that anybody would like to get in as one final question or observation? Well, I'm going to respond in sort of an oblique way to, KR has something here. Socialism, I'm looking at the chat now. Socialism in general might have more support if more people understood what it's about and how it could benefit them. And that is true. Terms like socialism and capitalism have such slippery meanings anyway, and most people seem to have some idea, but not a very firm idea of exactly what they mean by these terms. So I agree. Would you like to comment on that, John? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like any of these political terms, they're kind of a convenience for but are ultimately maybe not adequate, and they come with a lot of baggage, and we have to deal with that baggage. One of the simplest descriptions I heard at a rock concert last year with the British punk musician Billy Bragg, he called socialism organized compassion, and I thought that was a useful way to just think about it. But it, to really unpack what it would mean and how it operates, and what people think it means when they think of Medicare or the post office or the libraries, to me is more about social welfare than what a real socialism would be, where resources and ownership of resources is shared, and we don't have such inordinate and obscene class divides that we are seeing. But yeah, you can't have a proper discussion of these in a few moments and expect people to understand the full gamut of what that could mean. But I think I'd like to think that intuitively people recognize that as Helen says at the, I'm thinking of the thing she says at the very beginning, that she didn't like the world as it is and wants it to be better, just that simple thing, that there's, you look, if you've got your eyes open, you can see that people are suffering, and why are they suffering, and why are they continuing to suffer, and what role do any of it, how can we think we don't shoulder some measure of responsibility for the world as we find it? It's too easy to blame other people for as being the sole causes for the situation that exists around us. We all play a part in it.
Well, on that note, that very true note, I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. And John, I really especially want to thank you. It's a remarkable film. It's a film which is thought-provoking in all the very, very best ways. And I am just so delighted that it is really getting out there and finding an audience. And I'm sure that it will have an influence not only politically, but aesthetically on our film culture and our general culture in the immediate future. And so I thank you for the film, and I thank you even more for being here with us today. Thank you so, so much.
I'm deeply touched, David, and I thank you. I understand that you brought the film to the attention of your son, and then from there to the festival. So I'm very grateful for that. I actually remember you. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you from many years ago when there was the Jean-Luc Godard Hail Mary project at Harvard, and I was involved in that, and I think you were too.
Yep.
So I have great respect for your thoughtfulness around cinema. And
Well, that's very sweet of you to say, and our paths have crossed occasionally over the years, and I'm very glad this is another such occasion. And I guess I played a small part in helping RIF pay attention to this movie, but also Craig played a big part in that as well. And thank you, Craig, for having all of us too.
sorry we can't all be together in Vermont, which is always a beautiful place to be, and that people could see this. I've only once myself ever seen this film on a projected.
Wow.
So I think that will start to change. Lincoln Center is planning at this point to reopen in July. So we'll see. Hopefully some of you who liked it might someday get to it was, for those of us who were in that theater, we thought it looked pretty nice up there on the big screen.
Okay, well, we might give it, we might be in touch with you about screening it up here when we get back into our space. And that'll be happening in fall for us.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful film and for joining us today. And Pop, you too. And I should just say that our selection committee, which is a very inclusive group of 15 people, everybody loved it. It was just a unanimous decision. So it really just made such a great impression. And our audience so far has reacted very positively. So thanks again.
It means a lot. My so-called career has often led my work more often to be shown outside the US than in the US, even though most of my films are about the US. So I'm always grateful when some part of this country finds it interesting enough to spend their time with. So.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Okay, be well, everyone.
You too, John.
Thank you, John. Great film.